Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Economic Updates webinar, hosted by Bialke Financial Partners. I'm Chris Bialke, founder of Bialke Financial Partners and LPL Financial Advisor. And I'm pleased to have you all listen in on what promises to be an insightful discussion on key economic trends shaping our financial future. It's an honor to be joined by Dr. Jeffrey Roach, Chief Economist at LPL, whose expertise spans capital markets, global macroeconomic research, and portfolio management. Together, we'll explore critical topics, including economic trends, policy shifts, geopolitical influences on stability, market insights, and more. Dr. Roach, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. I truly appreciate this opportunity to ask questions on behalf of our firm and our clients. So let's dive right in, starting with current economic trends. Do the economic cycles move more rapidly as technology continues to advance?
Well, that's great to tie in technology to markets and the economy. I think it is fair to say, we were just joking with my teenager. We went through college without a smartphone. He's going to be very different. So just the speed of information that hits you on your smartphone does impact how markets behave, how the economy behaves, the way that we shop, the way that we search for houses, right? Really. So you think about the dramatic moves that have happened over the last really 2 decades, shorten it maybe just 1 decade. Things do move faster than they did before. You could potentially argue maybe there's less inefficiencies, right? Because the law of one price is still holds, and maybe we get to that law of one price a little bit faster. Who knows? That's still debatable. But that certainly does seem to, in some ways, speed up kind of the movements of the economy. It doesn't necessarily speed up the business cycle, though. You think about pre-pandemic and post-Great Financial Crisis, that period of time called the Great Moderation, we had very slow and steady movements in the economy, in the way that the economy grew and advanced. So in some ways, we have to be careful when we use the phrase, hey, technology speeds up the economy and how we react. That doesn't necessarily mean more volatility.
Sure. So questions we get a lot is, with the attention to government spending, which is a hot topic, and reform, how much will this impact the long-term economy?
Right. So DOGE is a hot topic. I like to tell people, when I talk to advisors and clients, I remind folks, remember, this is not necessarily anything new. So President Obama had a strategy to make the government more efficient. Actually, I like to reference Al Gore chairing this National Review Board. I think they call it the NPR. So it was some type of regulatory efforts that the president at the time, President Clinton, wanted to sign, say, okay, let's make the government less wasteful. Right. So it's something that happens every single time a new president comes in. Let's cut waste and create efficiency. I think what's different this time is that DOGE might actually do something more dramatic than what we've seen in previous administrations. But the concept's nothing new.
Sure.
I think that's really important for people to remember. It's not a new world order in that sense, even though a number of publications seem to be using that phrase these days. So will it affect the economy? Absolutely. The effect may not be as dramatic as we might think. You think about Bill Clinton cut over 300,000 federal workers. Mm-hmm. The unemployment rate did not change. Right. So I think in that sense, you think about, well, if the labor market's still very tight, and if DOGE eventually does get a recommendation out there, and then those that actually can make the action take the recommendation, and we cut federal workers, I think they'll be able to re-enter and stay in the workforce fairly easily, given the fact that there's a lot of opportunities out there outside of just the federal workforce.
Sure. And our families and our firms are cutting every day. So how might geopolitical events influence economic stability, and will it decouple globally from being interdependent?
Right. So when you think geopolitical shocks, you really have to break out between your more developed economies and your emerging economies. So I think probably underlying your question, you think about, okay, what's it going to do to the U.S.? The U.S. tends to be able to take these shocks in stride a little bit better. You think about the number of shocks we had in economy, both inside our country and outside our country. Think about Silicon Valley Bank. Fairly isolated, didn't necessarily spread through the rest of the economy. Think about the shock from Russia-Ukraine conflicts. Yes, impacted some economies, but not much. I should say not as much U.S. However, when you think about geopolitical risks, I think one way to practically make an application is for those of us, as you, the financial advisor, thinking about how to direct portfolios. You might say, okay, that's one of the reasons why we're a little bit cautious going internationally during times of geopolitical risk. Domestic exposure, a little less risky, particularly to things like in the Middle East or Europe or Latin America.
And which emerging markets do you see as having a potential for growth, with that said?
Right. So outside the U.S., typically, when you think about, again, back to portfolios, client assets, how do you protect those and how do you manage them? I think you do have to be careful to break out your more risky emerging markets and your less risky developed economies, developed international. So think Germany, France, UK, Japan. That's your developed internationals. Your emerging internationals would be China, India, Argentina. I think at this point, some of the economic data suggests that countries like India are showing some stability. We're still a little bit cautious when it comes to China, for example. There's still a lot of pressure, downside pressure on their domestic economy. Still a little bit of uncertainty about their property markets and how that's going to roll through into the Chinese consumer. So specifically for your question, where would we look if we wanted to look outside the U.S.? And if we want to say, let's take some emerging market exposure, I think two things to think about. One is think things like India, where some of the economic data suggests some stability. Also think, what are your views about the dollar? If the U.S. dollar is going to weaken a little bit from here, that's typically good for emerging economies and emerging markets that have more exposure to the U.S. currency. And so as the U.S. weakens, their dollar weakens, that actually might be an opportunity to say, okay, maybe it is time to start allocating and diversifying, including emerging markets for client portfolios.
Sure. And what are your expectations for inflation and interest rates in the coming year? We hear more about that.
Right. So 2025 has been really unusual in that when we started out, maybe January, December, there was a lot of extreme views that the Fed was going to cut a lot in 2025. Interestingly enough, when we had that January inflation print, that is always a little bit on the hotter side in January. Januaries are always unusual. However, that said, the markets really switched to the other extreme. Hey, maybe the Fed's going to hike in 2025. We did not change our views that we actually wrote about just right after the election or early November. We said 2 or 3 cuts. We were leaning toward 3. After January, we were a little bit more cautious, saying, oh, maybe that's not going to play out. 2 or 3 cuts. And of course, for our listeners here, when we say a cut, it's in 25 basis point increments, or say it another way, 25 basis points is 1/4%. So if we say a cut, that's a 25 basis point or 1/4% cut. If we say 3 or 4 or 4 cuts, that would be a full 1% cut. We think the Fed's going to cut this year. We do think that inflation, to your question about inflation specifically, will look pretty good by the time we get to May, April and May.
Okay.
Inflation will look pretty good. Part of it is due to the fact that you had some base effects from April and May in 2024. So when we hit April, May 2025, those annual inflation rates are going to look pretty good. So I think the Fed cuts in June and then 2 more times as the economy weakens. The big unknown is how much tariffs, if implemented, and if firms don't get as many exclusions and exemptions as we think, and if businesses feel the ability to pass along the prices to end consumers, we might see a little bit of inflationary pressure the latter half of 2025. So instead of 3 cuts, maybe just 2 cuts.
Sure, thank you. And another hot item is, how is technology affecting economic growth and productivity with AI?
So technology does create a disruption. Disruptions can be good, by the way, right? So it's not always bad. It's kind of like volatility. When there's volatility in the market, volatility is often couched in the downside, but volatility can be good because that means there's some upside moves too. So a disruption from technology is normal. We see that all the time, but we have to be really careful to not get too negative, I think, on the disruption, because I think this is a super helpful stat. I've said it a lot over the last little bit. I have a colleague who does research at MIT. He's talked about the disruptions of technology, and he likes to say, look, 60% of jobs today did not exist in the late 40s. So think about your grandparents' age, maybe your, great-grandparents, a few generations. As time passes, the job market adjusts to those disruptions, and you have that stat: 60% of jobs today didn't exist back then. That's helpful to think about. Now, granted, there are going to be winners and losers. If your grandparent was a telegraph operator, or I was talking to someone recently, his dad had started out being a typewriter repair guy. Okay, you'll have to adjust.
Right.
So those specific tasks certainly change over time, but it's not as if technology replaces humans. Right. AI and technology in general is not a substitute. It's a complement, I like to say. Work together. It's a complement, not substitute.
Sure. Well, thank you. And I'm glad there's not looters out there. I appreciate it. How can small business leverage economic trends with this new AI and to their advantage?
Well, I think we talked about this at the very beginning, thinking about business cycles and how the economy adjusts to having a smartphone in our pocket.
Right.
And just the information there. I think what's really exciting, particularly those that have the entrepreneurial spirit, creative spirit, typically small businesses start that way. Hey, you got an idea. I want to see if there's a market for it, and let's bring it to market and see if we can do something interesting with the idea. I think small businesses do have an opportunity for there's a lot of data from the fact that we all carry smartphones around. Everybody knows what we're talking about, what we're thinking about, what our next vacation is going to be, and using those data points in a creative way certainly can be a net positive for small businesses. Think about the whole gig economy. Think about how Airbnb has been able to capture that, understanding consumer behaviors and monetizing that. It's amazing.
Well, thank you for that information. My clients and I appreciate it from Bialke Financial Partners. We look forward to reaching out to your expertise and leveraging LPL and all they have to offer. We're so blessed to be able to be here today. And I really appreciate your time helping us out and helping all the advisors out there. You are a true gem. So I appreciate it. Thank you.